The day began like any other for Cheryl and Paul Chapman until the silence of a peaceful Sunday morning was shattered with a phone call. Cheryl's sister Nancy had not shown up for work, and several attempts to reach her by phone were unsuccessful. The Chapmans, sensing something must be wrong,
Nancy?
rushed to her apartment.
Some killers are stealthy, killing with an almost clinical precision. Others act on a violent impulse, saturating the crime scene with their rage. How a murderer behaves tells much about who he is. In 1987, the brutality of a triple homicide in Anchorage tested the mettle of even the most seasoned investigators. I'm Jim Kallstrom, former director of the FBI's New York office. When Nancy Newman and her 2 young daughters were found slain in their apartment, local law enforcement needed help. They called the FBI. At the crime scene, clues were everywhere, but seemed to lead nowhere. Agents knew that to crack this case, they need to somehow get inside the killer's mind.
Alaska sits on the edge of the wilderness, seemingly isolated from the rest of the world and its troubles. Its inhabitants are united by the beauty of the landscape and a mutual respect for the self-reliant nature of the community.
On the rocky coast of northern France, where the Atlantic Ocean crashes ashore, the villagers of Karnak wake up each day to a rhythm.
It was shortly before 8 a.m. on a Sunday, March 15th, 1987. Cheryl and Paul Chapman were awakened by a phone call.
No.
Cheryl's sister, Nancy Newman, was hours late for the breakfast shift at the restaurant where she worked. Nancy's shift manager told Cheryl that Nancy's car was in the restaurant parking lot, but Nancy was nowhere in sight. Maybe the Chapmans should check on her. From the moment Paul and Cheryl arrived at Nancy's apartment, they sensed something was wrong. There was no sign of Nancy. Her 2 daughters, 8-year-old Melissa and 3-year-old Angie, were nowhere in sight. Coffee mugs from Cheryl's Friday night visit with her sister were still in the sink. The remains of breakfast had been left on the table. The tin where Nancy kept her tip money sat empty. And a brown cigarette butt, not a brand Nancy smoked, was in the ashtray.
Nancy? Nancy?
In Nancy's bedroom, Paul made a gruesome discovery. He found Nancy lying beaten and lifeless on her bed. Paul rushed to the other bedrooms to find Nancy's 2 girls. To his horror, he found Melissa and Angie brutally murdered.
Come on, let's go.
Emergency.
Yes, ready to get the police, please.
What's the problem now?
It's been homicide.
We've been a homicide?
Our sister-in-law didn't show up from work. They called us at our house when Milford seen her. We came over to find her.
Where at?
4310. And it's terrible.
Just send somebody to see me bad.
We've got some on you right now.
Contact 2 at your miss.
Within minutes, the first Anchorage police officers arrived at the Newman's apartment. Not wanting to disturb the crime scene, the officers secured the area and tried to calm the distraught family until the crime scene processing unit arrived. What police found was horrific. Nancy and Melissa Newman appeared to have been beaten and strangled. Little Angie Newman's throat was cut so deeply she was almost decapitated.
Nice. Rigger?
Not yet.
Is it sick?
Anchorage police officer Bill Gifford was at the scene.
Well, the impact of a case like this is quite often it's hard to capture in words. We're pretty used to working homicide cases and serious assault cases, and overall I think a community becomes, if not callous, somewhat accustomed to these kind of things happening, just a typical murder. Something of this magnitude, however, people are never prepared for.
The murders were so gruesome that even experienced police officers were shaken.
It is shocking for the public, and it takes a toll on the investigators and the officers working the case as well, because you're just not used to seeing, as I mentioned, things of this magnitude.
Nancy Newman's body was lying on her bed, her nightgown hiked up around her chest. There were abrasions on her nose, chin, and forehead, and a knee seemed to be injured. Bloodstains were at the foot of the bed. A pair of olive green gloves were on top of the dresser.
Good idea with probably. Yeah, do a scrape so they can get some.
Down the hall, Melissa Newman was found on her back in the middle of her room. A bloody, twisted pillowcase under her neck. Another pillowcase had been used to tie her arms. Three-year-old Angie Newman lay on her bedroom floor in a pool of blood, surrounded by her favorite books.
A couple shots of the face. There's the bed where all the blood is. Everybody's ready? Here it is.
Bloodstain pattern analysis often yields clues. The positions of the victims and killer. The movements of the victims. And the number of blows struck can be reconstructed by an experienced examiner.
In this particular case, it assisted us in establishing a sequence of events.
Stains found on Nancy Newman's bed suggested that she and Melissa had been forced down the hall to her mother's room, where they were assaulted. And stains on the hallway carpeting indicated that Melissa was then returned to her room and killed there. Officers treated each area as a completely separate crime scene. First, they determined the type of physical evidence that was likely to be found, and then the order it should be processed.
How are we doing?
Given the horrific nature of this crime and the lack of an obvious suspect, investigators knew that every possible piece of physical evidence was potentially invaluable.
Here, all these plates. Anything else was covered all yet? Super. Great.
Detective Sergeant Michael Grimes was in charge of the Anchorage Police Department's Homicide, Assault, and Robbery Unit.
I knew that they were going to be in this crime scene for hours and hours and hours. This immediately is what we identify as a forensic case. There was very little disturbed by them when they found the bodies, so we were very fortunate in that respect.
Investigators frequently find evidence in common household dirt. Sometimes hair and fibers buried in carpeting can be traced to a suspect. For thorough coverage, investigators broke each room into quadrants and vacuumed each section. To begin the painstaking task, investigators must first cordon off a 3-foot by 4-foot area of the room. The investigator uses an ordinary vacuum with a special filter attachment. As the debris is pulled off the floor, it travels down a short tube and then goes into a collection point. There it becomes trapped in clean filter paper. Once a quadrant of the room has been processed, the filter is removed and placed into an evidence container. Many minute hairs and fibers are missed by crime scene vacuumings. Therefore, a portable argon laser is used, which causes unseen hairs and fibers to fluoresce when exposed to the laser's light.
Package that.
Let's not lose any of this, okay?
That's for sure. Got it.
A technique called luminol processing was also used to look for traces of blood. If present, the luminol spray will cause the proteins in the blood to fluoresce, making them visible to examiners.
We were processing the scene and looking for invisible traces or invisible blood patterns. And we found a luminescent impression that we were able to photograph. We also knew we had a knife missing out of the kitchen. We took one of those knives out of the knife set, and we found that matched in width and length to that of the luminol impression that we had.
Go ahead and check the bathroom.
The crime scene appearance suggested the murderer had taken the victims by surprise.
Check his washcloth before we package it up, okay? Make sure there's nothing inside of it.
It appeared that Newman's morning routine was suddenly interrupted, perhaps indicating that they knew the killer.
Okay, excellent. Good job. Go ahead and mark that.
A big question was motive. At the scene, Cheryl told police that Nancy seemed to have no enemies. As a waitress, she was popular among her customers and colleagues, friendly without being flirtatious. And what possible motive could explain the rage inflicted upon 8-year-old Melissa and 3-year-old Angie?
Did you have a good time tonight?
Burglary was unlikely. It was obvious to investigators that the apartment had not been ransacked or otherwise disturbed. Investigators struggled to find a solid lead. Detective Bill Reeder worked the case from the beginning.
The initial lead came from the scene itself, that we could find no signs of forced entry. So that kind of leaned us toward looking at people that had access to the apartment or knew the victims.
Immediately the questioning began. Neighbors, family and friends, anyone who may have had information.
What we were looking at was to find someone that had seen anything unusual, any strangers in the area, had heard anything unusual, had seen someone carrying things away, anything at all that would help us focus on someone or somebody.
Family members are almost always suspects early in an investigation. Paul Chapman was no exception. Though he had no one to back up his alibi, which was that he was alone most of Saturday, his reaction to discovering the bodies was clearly one of trauma and loss. Investigators spoke with everyone close to the family. and learned that Nancy Newman was happily married to John Newman, the father of their 2 girls. He was a suspect, spouses usually are. But John Newman was in California training to be a locksmith at the time of the murders.
Another way to eliminate a suspect is to watch and continue to talk to him. John never gave us any indication other than he wanted this case solved. He was extremely distraught, gave all the signs that anybody would give under the circumstances.
Because the Newmans lived in a multi-unit apartment complex, Detective Grimes knew that interviewing neighbors in the immediate area would be a daunting task.
There was an apartment in a multi-unit apartment house, which was in a particular area of town that was surrounded by large multi-unit apartment houses, and we were looking at literally hundreds of dwellings in that area.
The close-knit community of Anchorage was shocked by the brutality of the murders. Police investigators, having no experience with crimes this shocking, were asking the most frightening of all possible questions. Was a serial killer a possibility? Police felt pressured to work quickly.
What kind of person would do this kind of crime? Was there significance in the way the people were murdered that could give us some kind of leads as to who we were looking for, or at least what type of person? And so immediately, I'd say within the first day or so, we were getting some help from the FBI.
Investigators quickly realized they needed help in determining the type of individual responsible for the murders. They turned to the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit at Quantico, Virginia. Special Agent Judd Ray received the call. As a profiler in the unit, Ray's job was to assist investigators in hunting down America's worst killers. To do that, Ray had to understand the workings of a killer's mind.
We were looking at deeds and acts of individuals after it happened and trying to predict the kind of personality, if you will, a composite view of what kind of human being could have done it.
Through detailed evaluations of crime scene photos and police reports, Ray provided investigators with a psychological portrait of the killer.
This is a disorganized crime scene. I mean, you know, low self-esteem, all the kinds of things that you would say about this kind of person. You know, that society has rejected him through the years, and now it's his time to reject society.
Ray told the Anchorage detectives that they possibly faced a repeat performance.
This particular incident alarmed him so much, particularly with 3 victims at one time, 2 being children, that his opinion also, he said that we need to get something working on this right away, because it appears that this person's out of control, and there's the potential that he's going to be doing it again in the very near future.
From the autopsy reports, investigators learned that Nancy and 8-year-old Melissa Newman had been sexually assaulted. Based on this information and characteristics of the crime, Ray concluded that this violent offender would have a history of sexual assault. He would be a white male in his early to mid-20s, an underachiever. Following Ray's conclusions, investigators began to narrow the range of possible suspects. Among them was a young man who had recently moved in a few doors down from the Newmans. Police also questioned Kirby Anthony, the 23-year-old nephew of John Newman. Anthony had an alibi into the morning hours of Saturday, March 14th, but the neighbor did not.
There was tremendous rage that was inflicted on the almost decapitated the young 3-year-old. Suggested that to me that there's nothing in my mind that I had came across that would have been sufficient on its face to justify this kind of rage by a stranger.
Ray's insistence that the killer was known to the victims led investigators to shift focus away from the man who lived nearby. Neighbors and friends of the Newmans confirmed the young man's claim that he had never met Nancy Newman or her children.
Because I had talked about familiarity, somebody that's close to the family, somebody that knows her, that had some sort of relationship with her, perhaps even been rejected by her. They said, well, as a matter of fact, there's a nephew that comes to mind.
As investigators continued questioning possible suspects, the volume of evidence that had been collected from the crime scene was taxing the limits of Alaska's state crime lab. Once again, Anchorage police turned to the FBI. The evidence was sent to the FBI's crime lab in Washington, D.C. Hair and fiber expert Doug Diedrich was given the case. Diedrich began by sorting through the evidence, searching for any link to a suspect. Hairs, fibers, glass particles, soil, paint chips, anything that may have been transferred during the killer's violent contact with his victims.
Altogether, I believe I looked at over 300, close to 400 items of evidence from the crime scene, from the victims, from elimination samples from different people, both suspect and relatives and possible acquaintances.
Fibers are unusually difficult to trace, and because no one knew what the killer was wearing during the murders, there was no basis in which to compare recovered fibers.
The varieties that are out there are endless, so that when an individual in a case, for instance, who is wearing a particular type of clothing transfers fiber material, that evidence will be considered to be unique. Even though they may have made a number of garments of the same type, by the time it gets out into the public, this material is dispersed like a drop of oil in the ocean. It's there, but it's hard to find.
Distinct fibers, amounting to less than a thimbleful of evidence, were recovered from throughout the Newman's apartment. Diedrich's expertise of fiber transfer, however, enabled him to reconstruct the suspect's movements during the crime, giving investigators a clearer picture of what actually transpired in the apartment. As Diedrich's analysis progressed, Anchorage police asked Kirby Anthony to come to the police department to give more detailed statements. They began to learn more of his story.
And Rose?
Anthony and his girlfriend had moved from Twin Falls, Idaho to Anchorage 18 months earlier. Both had stayed at the Newmans for a while, but were asked to leave about the time they found jobs on a fishing boat.
And I'm faithful, but we're not married.
He and his girlfriend split up while working on the boat after Kirby accused her of having an affair with the skipper. His mates described him as irrational and unstable after the breakup. He clashed with the skipper and was fired. He returned to Anchorage alone on February 14th, 1987. Having nowhere else to go, Anthony took a taxi from the airport straight to the Newmans. Through Cheryl Chapman's continued assistance, police learned that John Newman was upset over his nephew's return to the Newman household during his absence. At the same time, the situation was becoming increasingly uncomfortable for Nancy. After a few weeks, she asked Anthony to leave. He moved in with an acquaintance, Dan Grant. As the investigation began to focus on Kirby Anthony, Sergeant Grimes recalled his first encounter with him. The day of the murders, Detective Grimes took on the task of notifying Anthony about the deaths.
I told him that we had some bad news for him, that his aunt and her two little girls had been found dead just earlier that morning. As I recall, Kirby grabbed his hair and started wailing and moaning, but it was all dry-eyed. There was no tears.
Either Phil or...
Anthony's demeanor did not fit that of a grieving family member. But Grimes knew that Anthony's odd behavior would never justify an arrest.
Well, I know I was.
The autopsy report, however, made investigators more suspicious. Autopsy results helped pinpoint the murders between 7 a.m. and noon on Saturday, March 14th.
What we're able to demonstrate is that the murders happened early in the morning, after the victims had gotten up in the morning. One of the victims had had a bowl of cereal. The other was in the process of eating some cereal. The mother was in the process of having a cup of coffee.
Establishing the time of the deaths made Anthony's alibi irrelevant, which was that he was at an all-night party until early that Saturday morning. He admitted that he drank, smoked some marijuana, and did cocaine.
Hey man, wake up! Get up, man!
He said he returned to the house he shared with Dan Grant at about 7 a.m., then left again at about 8:45 a.m. Meanwhile, FBI agent Diedrich's investigation into fiber and hair evidence was growing more complicated.
One of the items that had come in consisted of vacuum sweepings. At least there were several vacuum sweepings from different rooms. Those items have to be processed and hairs have to be prepared from that. What was, I think, probably the most difficult aspect of this case for me was in trying to account for every hair that was found in that residence. And that's something that's not usually done and seen as there are often too many hairs to deal with. But in this case, it was a monumental task to do that.
Each hair displays its own peculiar characteristics under a microscope, making it possible to trace its likely origin.
The fact that hairs will differ from person to person is very evident when you magnify these characteristics upwards of 250, 400 times.
To examine the fibers and hairs collected at the scene, Diedrich used two high-powered comparison microscopes connected by an optical bridge, one for known material and the other for material yet to be identified. Because Anthony had lived with the Newmans for a while, his hair was likely to be in the apartment. That meant it was important to establish whether the trace hairs were old or recent. So Diedrich went through the contents of the vacuum used in the Newman household.
Because of the vast quantities of hairs and other items that were found in the bag, I had to look at the vacuum bag from a layer standpoint. That is, what was the most recently deposited or recently vacuumed material.
Since Kirby Anthony had denied being in the Newmans' apartment recently, it was imperative that Diedrich determine the condition of the hairs.
The condition of the surface of hairs, the condition of the ends, the roots, will often indicate how long a hair may have been in a particular environment.
Working his way through the layers of the Newmans' vacuum bag, Diedrich found some of the same types of hairs that did not appear to belong to any of the Newmans. These hairs had been recently deposited. In addition to the vacuum sweepings, unidentified pubic hairs were also found on the victims and inside their bedrooms. To determine the significance of these findings, Diedrich now wanted to know how hairs usually are transferred from one room to another. So he conducted his own experiment.
It was a question as to how likely would it be to find somebody's hairs, say pubic hairs, in different areas of a home. So I designed a little experiment where I took a vacuum home, crime scene vacuum, to my house and vacuumed 4 bedrooms over a 2-week period, same time every day, just to see what types of hairs might be found. I was focusing mainly on pubic hairs.
Diedrich preserved the material from every sweeping. He then compared the hairs from those sweepings with known hairs from himself. Diedrich was able to conclude that the hairs did migrate from room to room, mostly by sticking to socks or other clothing. The hairs deposited at the beginning of the experiment were deeper in the vacuum debris and therefore more damaged. The more recently deposited ones were not. The finding was significant to Diedrich. Since Cheryl told police that Nancy vacuumed her house Friday, the unidentified hairs found on the victims would have been deposited right at the time of the murders. Under microscopic scrutiny, an important piece of evidence was revealed. A pubic hair with a partial egg casing, the kind associated with genital lice, was clinging to the damp washcloth found in the Newman's bathroom. Diedrich told investigators of his findings and waited for a sample from a suspect in order to make a comparison. There were at least a half a dozen individuals who were considered prime suspects. Investigators received lists from the State Corrections Department of people recently released who had a history of sex crimes or violence. Some of them were living in the area close to the Newmans. To eliminate these individuals as suspects, each one was extensively questioned and all of their alibis were checked out. Police continued to question Anthony. He admitted nothing. But with each interview, the details of where he was and what he did the morning of the murders changed slightly.
That was kind of an indicator of what we were going to be dealing with Kirby from the get-go, was these little lies that weren't necessary but were thrown out to us.
Unaware of Diedrich's hair analysis, Anthony was asked by investigators to submit hair and blood samples. Wanting to appear cooperative, he voluntarily submitted the samples. They were rushed to Diedrich for comparison. The next day, Diedrich notified investigators that Anthony had pubic lice.
Well, that was probably the most significant breakthrough. At that point, we could start focusing on Kirby as the suspect.
When confronted with the evidence of the hair and egg casing on the washcloth, Anthony admitted that he did have lice. He said he had showered at the Newmans a week before the murders so as not to spread the pubic lice at Dan Grant's house. For Judd Ray, the dirty washcloth left at the crime scene told much about the suspect. The killer had cleaned himself at the murder scene. Why take the risk? Why not go home?
It was obvious to me that he had to go somewhere where he couldn't go there all bloody, which sort of got into this guy's not a loner living alone somewhere.
Ray's behavioral profile also predicted the killer would have been associated with a previous sexual assault. This prediction prompted investigators to look deeper into Kirby's past. They learned that Kirby Anthony had been the central suspect in an Idaho case that remains open to this day. The victim, a 12-year-old girl, suffered brain damage in the attack and was unable to testify.
He had, just previous to coming to Alaska, been the focus of police attention down there. They had some type of outdoor picnic outing, and There was a 12-year-old that was found in the woods. She had been strangled, unconscious, near death, and she had been sexually assaulted. Their investigation pointed right at Kirby Anthony.
Ray also predicted the killer would want to appear cooperative with police.
They told us that the suspect would interject himself into the investigation. He would call to find out what the evidence was showing, and Kirby started doing that.
What investigators did not share with Anthony was that Diedrich's other hair comparisons were also pointing to Anthony. The pubic hair found on the washcloth was only one of many positive associations Diedrich was able to make between hairs found at the crime scene and those submitted by Anthony.
And in this case, a number of pubic hairs that were like Kirby Anthony's were found in the rooms, both the victims' rooms, the two girls, and as well as a couple of them that were similar to his on the bed of the mother.
A hair from Anthony's head also was found on the top sheet of Nancy Newman's bed. Facial hairs that matched Anthony's beard were found on all of the victims and in their rooms. The vacuum sweepings from Melissa's room contained 9 of Anthony's pubic hairs. The sweepings from Angie's room included 2 pubic hairs, one with blood and one with lice casings. Investigators felt it was time to keep tabs on Anthony's movements. Through surveillance, investigators learned of Anthony's hangouts and discreetly followed him around town. They hoped that Anthony would reveal something to his friends that would further implicate him in the murders. If he did, the investigators would soon find out. The effort paid off. One of Anthony's acquaintances told investigators that he was writing poetry on napkins and passing the poems around the table. He told one of the women that Nancy Newman had been forced to watch part of the assault.
It was my aunt, 2 nieces.
Investigators also learned that at one point after the murders, Anthony called his ex-girlfriend's mother in Idaho to tell her about the crime. Angie Newman had been stabbed, he said, and Nancy and Melissa sexually assaulted. In both instances, the call to Idaho and the scene at the bar, Anthony could not yet have known about the details he described.
You must have read a different article.
The information had not been released by police to the press, nor had investigators mentioned it to Anthony during questioning.
Pretty sick. I don't remember those details. You did?
Since the surveillance was not a 24-hour-a-day tactic, they would often drive by his house to see if his vehicle was parked out front. If he was home, investigators would often ask him to answer some questions. The circumstantial evidence against Anthony was mounting. During a visit to his residence, investigators noticed a manually operated camera belonging to John Newman that had been reported missing after the murders. He told detectives that the Newmans lent it to him, but when asked later to demonstrate how it worked, he seemed to have no idea how to operate it. Another item missing from the Newman house seemed to be traceable to Anthony. The tip money missing from the cookie tin consisted only of coins. 3 of Anthony's friends told police they either saw him rolling coins into wrappers or saw him pay for items with wrapped coins. And then there were the prints. Anthony's palm print was found on the wall over the bed where Melissa Newman had been assaulted. Prints found on the empty cookie tin on the kitchen table matched Anthony's. His prints were also found on the living room closet door and the inside and outside of the apartment door.
Another place we located one of Kirby's fingerprints was on the back side of the door to the mother's bedroom. And again, its position was significant in that it led us to believe that perhaps someone was trying to escape out of the room, and he already had some other trace evidence on his hand. He slammed the door shut, transferring not only his fingerprint, but some of the other trace evidence that was found in the scene.
The evidence was overwhelming. Every suspect in the month-long investigation had ultimately been cleared, except Kirby Anthony.
Appreciate that.
When you got home, was there anyone there?
For investigators, it was time to obtain an arrest warrant.
And when you got home?
Judd Ray had previously cautioned investigators that the killer might try to flee if the pressure became too much. The increasing intensity of police questioning had made Anthony nervous. Judd Ray was right again. Anthony confided to his roommate, Dan Grant, that he was leaving town. He asked his friend not to tell police. Grant was afraid to contact Anchorage police because of Anthony's notorious temper.
Second precinct task.
Nonetheless, he did finally call them 7 hours later.
Okay.
Anthony was heading to the Canadian border, an 8-hour drive away, and he had a 7-hour head start. Anchorage and the Canadian border are separated by hundreds of miles of uninhabited wilderness. Anthony could be hiding anywhere. Anchorage police quickly contacted U.S. Customs at the Alaska-Canada border. They described Anthony in his vehicle and told the custom official that Anthony was a suspect in a triple homicide. They were hoping he was on his way. Less than an hour later, Anthony arrived at U.S. Customs. Having no idea that investigators had been tipped off, Anthony calmly pulled up to the customs gate.
Step out of the car. Could you get out of the car, please?
He was detained and questioned until Alaska state troopers arrived. He was arrested for driving on a suspended license and returned to Anchorage.
Thanks a lot for the hospitality there.
As he was turned over to the Anchorage police, he was read his rights and charged. 3 counts first-degree murder, 2 counts sexual assault, and 1 count kidnapping. Under Alaska law, kidnapping can be charged if a victim is restrained during an assault. Melissa Newman had been tied up during the attack.
He jumps up and screaming, "What is this kidnapping stuff?" Which struck us as odd because here he was charged with 3 counts of murder and 2 counts of sexual assault, and he's screaming about the kidnapping charge.
By this time, the forensic evidence was complete enough that police believed they could reconstruct how Angie, Melissa, and Nancy were brutally murdered. The last time Cheryl Chapman saw her sister alive was Friday, March 13th. Cheryl, Paul, and Nancy had each arrived separately at the restaurant where Nancy worked to meet for drinks. Cheryl's daughter, Kelly, had taken Nancy's girls swimming, so the adults had a night out. Paul Chapman had to leave the restaurant early to pick up his son, but planned to meet them later at Nancy's apartment. As they were leaving, Cheryl suggested that Nancy leave her car at the restaurant and ride home with her. Nancy had Saturday off, and Paul would gladly give her a ride back to her car tomorrow.
I don't know. I never pay attention to. You're in, what, 11:30?
Yeah. What time you come in?
11.
11?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'm
Cheryl, Paul, and Nancy all ended up at the Newmans' apartment to wait for Kelly and the girls. They sat, laughing and talking, until about 9:45 when the girls came home. Kelly had treated them to hamburgers. At about 10 p.m., Cheryl and Paul were ready to leave. Cheryl helped Nancy clear the table and put the used coffee mugs in the sink. Angie was already in her pajamas, and Melissa had gone to her room to get ready for bed. As they said goodnight, Paul told Nancy to call him the next day if she wanted a ride back to her car. Sometime between 7 a.m. and noon on Saturday, March 14th, Kirby Anthony arrived at the Newmans' apartment. Kirby Anthony is the only person who knows what happened next. Perhaps Nancy refused to lend him money. Perhaps she refused a sexual advance. Perhaps she ordered him out of the apartment. In any case, his anger boiled over. Evidence indicated that part of the assault on Melissa occurred in her mother's room. Both would have had to have been restrained, and their bodies did show signs of having been bound.
We are able to show through serological findings that Melissa, the 8-year-old, had been assaulted in the mother's bedroom and that she had crossed the bed and was actively bleeding at the time. And then she is subdued somehow and held in a position in that room for a period of time.
Melissa Newman probably witnessed the rape and murder of her mother. She then was taken back to her bedroom where she was assaulted again and killed. The knife used to kill little Angie was never recovered. It was unclear whether she was killed first or last. What was certain was that she seemed to be the target of a horrible, uncontrolled rage. Nancy Newman did not call Paul Chapman the next day for a ride to her car, nor did she answer the phone when her sister tried to reach her repeatedly. Instead, she and her 2 daughters lay dead nearly a full day before their bodies were discovered. The particular grudge against Angie may have grown out of the few times that Anthony babysat the girls. Reportedly, he had called her a tyrant. But for those close to the victims, and for investigators working the case, nothing could explain Kirby Anthony's savagery.
I don't really think that you could isolate any one thing that would cause a man to fly into the homicidal rage like Kirby Anthony did. Yeah, for the most part, you know, I don't think that Kirby Anthony could even tell you why he would do something like that.
A grieving John Newman sat in stony silence throughout his nephew's trial. After 8 weeks of testimony, the jury reached a verdict on June 3, 1988. A clean-shaven Anthony seemed confident as he waited for the verdict. As each guilty verdict was read, Anthony's composure disintegrated until finally it shattered completely. He was sentenced to 357 years for his crimes. Kirby Anthony's conviction represented an almost textbook example of cooperative police work. Anchorage police provided the FBI with evidence collected from a meticulously preserved crime scene.
Oh, yeah?
Doug Diedrich carefully analyzed the hairs and fibers and anticipated Kirby Anthony's excuses, conducting his own home experiment to refute them. Judd Ray helped police stay several steps ahead of Anthony's thoughts and actions. And for the first time, testimony of an FBI profiler was accepted in court.
It was a good case to test the waters in terms of whether or not this was going to be accepted in our judicial system. And for that, the implications are probably far-reaching because it opened the door.
The dense and rugged Alaskan wilderness provided the perfect cover for a fierce and sadistic killer. He preyed on women, kidnapping them, raping them, torturing them. He hunted them like animals for his own twisted pleasure.
In the 1970s and 80s, people went to Alaska looking for a fresh start, to reinvent themselves, or to disappear for a while. Some of those disappearances weren't by choice. I'm Jim Kallstrom, former head of the FBI's New York office. A serial killer's rampage was exposed when the bodies of young women began turning up in shallow graves that dotted the Alaskan wilderness. The killer was at home in the rugged terrain, but the hunt for him began 3,000 miles away, where FBI profilers mapped the criminal's mind.
She was a hopeful young model looking for her break. She accepted a job with a man who claimed to be a photographer, but turned out to be a merciless killer. She wasn't his first victim, or his last. From the 70s through the mid-80s, the wilderness of Alaska became a popular destination as people flowed north to construct the Alaskan pipeline. The population boomed. On August 13, 1982, two off-duty Anchorage police officers were hunting moose near the Knik River, in a wilderness about 20 miles from Anchorage. As they made their way through the dense forest, they happened upon partially buried human remains. they left it undisturbed. The next day, crime scene technicians from the Alaska State Troopers arrived at the scene. Crimes out here fell under state jurisdiction. Besides clothing and an elastic bandage, troopers found a .223 caliber shell casing in the shallow grave.
Conveniently buried here in the sand.
Dental records identified the remains as 23-year-old Sherry Morrow, an exotic dancer reported missing a year earlier by her boyfriend. Troopers called him in to break the news. Her clothes matched the ones he reported her missing in, but her good luck charm, the gold arrowhead pendant she never took off, was gone. Morrow was probably murdered shortly after she disappeared, giving the killer more than a year to cover his tracks. Finding him would be next to impossible. In the year following the discovery of Sherry Morrow's body, more women began turning up. It's a sad truth that finding bodies in the Alaskan wilderness wasn't all that unusual. 2 or 3 times a year, some novice hiker or hunter would get lost and succumb to the elements. But a growing number of bodies had a different story to tell. During new road construction on September 2nd, 1983, a crew unearthed human skeletal remains not far from where Sherry Morrow's body had been found 1 year earlier. The bones had obviously been here for some time, yet until recently this area of the Knik River was so remote that it could only be accessed by boat or light plane. The remains were identified as 17-year-old Paula Goulding, an out-of-work secretary who had moved to Alaska from Hawaii. She had been missing for 5 months. Like Sherry Morrow, she had taken a job as an exotic dancer to make ends meet. And like Sherry Morrow, a .223 caliber cartridge was found at the site. For Alaska State Trooper Wayne Van Clausen, the connection was frightening.
And that's about when everything started to become kind of scary for everybody, because the profile was the same. They were topless dancers from the clubs downtown, but that was certainly when there was the belief that there was a serial murderer out there.
2 bodies had been found, but now troopers believed there were more. They began to revisit missing persons reports. Many of those reported missing were exotic dancers, but in Alaska, their disappearance was not unusual.
Missing persons was a relatively low priority. Statutorily, if you're an adult, you have a right to be missing. And there were a lot of instances where these girls would just jump on a plane and go away.
Between 1980 and 1983, 12 women had been reported missing. That was only a fraction of the unreported total. Troopers now wondered how many of the missing women were victims of the killer. That would be difficult to determine. The Alaska State Troopers sent the evidence from the Sherry Morrow and Paula Goulding crime scenes to the FBI's laboratory in Washington, D.C. for analysis. The FBI ran ballistics tests on both shell casings to see if they were shot from the same gun. State troopers hoped the results could provide them with strong evidence that the same person committed both murders. The lab results were conclusive. Both women were killed by the same high-powered rifle. There was little doubt. Alaska troopers were dealing with a serial killer. While they began their hunt for him in the wilderness, the Anchorage police were dealing with their own problems. Every city has its dark side, and Anchorage is no different. Except that in Alaska, the nights are longer and darker. In the 70s and 80s, Anchorage was a frontier town. Men came here to work hard, and women followed to ease their loneliness. Some women were lured to the strip clubs, hoping to earn a quick buck. Others, looking for more respectable opportunities, worked in the clubs until something better came up. For many, it never did. And in the city's streets roamed a stalker. He chose carefully. His victims were hardly missed. For in a city made up largely of strangers, it's difficult to be a missing person. Some of the women who disappeared from Anchorage turned up safely. Some didn't turn up at all. But disappearances weren't the only crimes being reported. On the early morning of June 13, 1983, Cindy Paulson, age 17, ran down an Anchorage highway. She was partially dressed and in handcuffs. She managed to flag down a passing truck. She was running for her life. The motorist dropped her off at her motel apartment. The desk clerk had called the Anchorage police.
Miss Paulson?
An officer removed her handcuffs and tried to calm her.
You all right? Here, let me get this.
Anchorage police officer Greg Baker recalls the incident.
We found her in handcuffs with very little clothes on. She was real credible. She was very scared, she was very frightened, and she told us her story.
Paulson, the prostitute, told Baker that she picked up a trick the night before. She described him as wiry, scruffy, about 6 feet tall, with glasses and a stutter. He was not the kind of person she thought of as threatening. But as soon as she stepped into his car, he handcuffed her and put a wood-handled revolver to her head. They drove to a respectable residential neighborhood. He pulled her into his house. The place was well kept and full of hunting trophies. He had a chain hanging from the ceiling of his den. He chained her up and stripped her. And there she was tortured and raped repeatedly for hours. Then he went to take a nap, leaving her there. But he wasn't through yet. He said he was going to take her to his cabin in the wilderness. He said if she tried to get anyone's attention, he'd kill her, and them as well. He told her he already had his alibi worked out. His friends were willing to lie for him. No one would believe her story. They ended up at the airport. She could see him loading a weapon into a small aircraft. She also saw her chance for escape. Her one chance to save her life. The story sounded outrageous, but her genuine terror compelled Officer Baker to check it out.
I had a very street-smart female, scared to death, with a story about being taken at gunpoint and held prisoner at a specific location that she described where it was, so she knew where it was. She described the interior of the location. She described the den, up to and including various animals were mounted on the wall.
En route to the hospital for an examination, Paulson insisted on stopping at the airport to show police the airplane she had seen earlier. She positively identified it.
While we were in there, we had a security guard stop us and describe the car the same way that Cindy described the car, and in fact gave us a license number that license number confirmed the address, or the area at least, that Cindy had given us regarding where the house was.
Police went to the address to speak to the owner of the car. They arrived moments before he pulled up, driving the vehicle described by Cindy Paulson. So far, everything Paulson said had checked out. But the suspect had his own story to tell. According to the motor vehicle records, the car that Cindy Paulson was abducted in belonged to Robert Hansen, a baker in Anchorage. Hansen, who fit the description of the man Paulson described, calmly answered questions. He said he was at a friend's house from 5 p.m. to 11:30 p.m., repairing a seat for his airplane. Afterward, he went to the home of another friend and stayed until around 5:30 that morning. Then he went to the airport and installed the seat. Hansen gave police his consent to search his house. Again, his home was exactly as Paulson had described. That only proved she'd been in the house, not that Hansen had raped and tortured her there. They could find no evidence of that. They did notice a loose-fitting wall panel. Behind it, they found a collection of weapons, but that wasn't surprising. Hansen was an avid hunter. They did find a revolver, but it didn't match the one that Paulson described. The gun, the chain, and the blanket she was wrapped in were nowhere to be found. Hansen's car appeared equally clean. Anchorage police found nothing in his car that fit Paulson's story.
Those alibis were corroborated and verified, and Mr. Hansen was released after a consent search of his house.
Paulson, still shaken from her ordeal, was able to pick Hansen's picture out of a photo lineup. But when given the chance to take a lie detector test, she refused. Her occupation gave her an inherent distrust of the police, and gave police an inherent distrust of her. She felt she'd never be taken seriously. Soon after, she left town for a while to try to put the nightmare behind her. Anchorage authorities were willing to let it drop too.
I found out because the alibis were corroborated, and because they had a problem with Cindy Paulson appearing and disappearing, and of course her lifestyle left a lot to be desired, that the case had been suspended at the Anchorage Police Department.
Police had gathered no solid evidence linking her story to Robert Hansen. But for Officer Greg Baker, it wasn't over. He was one officer who believed Paulson's story and wouldn't let it go. The predator roaming the streets of Anchorage was still out there, free to claim more victims. Robert Hansen, the most likely suspect in the abduction and rape of Cindy Paulson, had been released for a lack of solid evidence. Officer Baker was still curious. Lately, the Anchorage police had been grappling with what seemed like more than their share of missing persons reports, involving prostitutes like Paulson, or exotic dancers, or women out by themselves. Paulson's assertion that she was about to be put on a plane only reinforced his creeping suspicions about Hansen.
He had taken her to the airport where he was going to fly her out with the story that if she maintained her helpfulness, that he'd bring her back and let her go. Well, Cindy was bright enough to know that she was on a one-way trip, and so was I. And so I kind of just put two and two together and figured that he was a very good suspect for the missing dancers.
Baker's supervisor had suspended the investigation into Robert Hansen, but Baker couldn't let it go. Cindy Paulson's nightmarish story had too much detail to not have some basis in truth. But no one except Baker would listen to her. He continued his investigation. On the surface, Baker found nothing in Hansen's record to arouse suspicion. He had moved to Anchorage from Iowa 16 years earlier and opened a bakery. It was a huge success. He had a wife and children, and except for his stutter, he fit in completely. When he wasn't in the kitchen, Hansen enjoyed flying his small airplane, a Super Cub Piper. Back on the ground, he took to the woods. He was a solid citizen. He just didn't fit the model of a serial killer. There were plenty of others drifting through Alaska more suited to that role. They didn't have businesses. They didn't have families. Hansen did. He had everything to lose. Frank Rothschild was a prosecutor involved in the Paulson case.
Bob the baker. The troopers and the police used to go to his donut shop all the time. It was a very popular place to go. He had a bakery. People knew him. He was friendly. He was just a hard-working guy.
Unaware of Officer Greg Baker's local investigation in Anchorage, state troopers were still trying to find their serial killer. Bodies continued to be unearthed in the Alaskan wilderness. Troopers set up a task force to study the similarities between the missing women and the murder victims. They hoped to find a common thread that would lead to a suspect. Until authorities knew more, they did their best to educate dancers and prostitutes about playing safe. For the first time, police and prostitutes were on the same side. According to Rothschild, the goal was preservation.
Law enforcement were then and had been for a time advising young women who were working in some of these clubs and who were working the streets to be careful and to advise them there was a maniac out there who seemed to be abducting and killing people.
A little digging revealed that Hansen's criminal history was extensive. 12 years earlier, in 1971, he'd been arrested twice for kidnapping, rape, and assault with a deadly weapon. They were crimes that bore an eerie resemblance to what Cindy Paulson had endured. Baker couldn't bring this information to his supervisor. The Paulson case had been officially suspended, and Baker was bucking authority. That left him no alternative.
And at that time, I gathered up all the reports and background that I could find on Mr. Hansen and carried it over to the troopers.
When the troopers received the file from Officer Baker, they were optimistic. Paulson's testimony, along with Hansen's police record from Anchorage, made him a prime suspect in the state case. The troopers' investigation dovetailed with Baker's. They were both dealing with the same maniac. Robert Hansen was their best suspect.
I think everybody was looking at him real seriously because he made a good suspect when you looked into him. He had a pretty extensive criminal background, including some sexual assaults.
The only problem was the proof. Though Hansen was a violent sex offender, his record indicated nothing about being capable of homicide, nor was there any direct link from him to Sherry Morrow, Paula Goulding, and the other missing women. At this point, troopers didn't even have enough for a search warrant. They knew only that 3 women were dead and 12 were missing. Out there lurked a serial killer. Troopers needed to catch him before he killed again. They needed help.
We knew we had a mass murder on our hands. That was not something Alaska had any experience with. Somebody obviously knew that the FBI not only had experience with it, but had set out this unit that was designed specifically to try to assist in discovering who these people were.
To catch a killer in their own backyard, the troopers called on help from over 3,000 miles away. Only the FBI had the resources needed to get inside a killer's head. When the Alaska State Troopers determined they had a serial killer on their hands, they realized they didn't have the expertise to stop him. But they knew who did. Quantico, Virginia is home to the FBI's Investigative Support Unit. Here, agents attempt to predict behavioral patterns by analyzing a criminal's actions. Retired FBI agent John Douglas helped pioneer behavioral profiling and still works as a consultant. His profiles are based on 25 years interviewing convicted killers. They taught Douglas how to think like they do. He's learned that serial killers are acting out their fantasies of control and conquest. As Douglas slowly wins their trust, he takes them back to the scene of their crime.
You finally get them talking, they start giving you that 1,000-yard stare. They're back 10 years ago, 20 years ago when they were perpetrating the crime, and they kind of lock into that 1,000-yard stare, and their memory is just so precise. And the fantasy is what keeps them going over and over and enables them to survive when they're incarcerated. So I got to tap into that. It takes time, but once I'm in there, I get tremendous information.
From these interviews, he distilled a checklist of traits and habits that serial killers share. They start young, with lesser crimes such as arson or cruelty to animals. Over the years, their violence builds. To every new case, profilers bring the knowledge of how killers evolve.
To understand the criminal, you must look at the crime. You just want to see if you can come up with an analysis based upon preliminary police reports, crime scene photographs, a profile of the victim, autopsy protocol, reviewing that, review the autopsy photographs, do an analysis of the overall crime, the risk level that the subject took, the victim risk level, analysis of the area, maybe the crime scene, maybe you have multiple crime scenes, and then based upon that, you attempt now to come up with a specific type of profile.
By examining every aspect of an unsolved crime, a profiler can determine specific characteristics of that killer, such as age, occupation, and physical characteristics. The troopers contacted the FBI to see if the Bureau could work up an analysis of the Anchorage killer. They hoped the profile would sharpen the investigation and bring overlooked clues to light. The troopers gave the FBI what they needed to build the behavioral profile. For a scrupulous, accurate profile, they required only facts from the troopers, no analysis or theories. Trooper Wayne Van Clausen didn't want to lose any time. The information he received from Officer Baker aroused his suspicions about Robert Hansen, but he needed more information. Criminal records were just beginning to be computerized, and he didn't have access to them all in Anchorage. While the profile was being developed, he went to Juneau to collect Hansen's records from the Superior and Supreme Court archives. In his fact-finding mission, Van Clausen researched every town that Hansen had ever lived in. He found reports on Robert Hansen dating back to 1961. He gathered all that he could carry, sent the rest by truck, then headed home. While he was in Juneau, the FBI had come through with a criminal profile of the serial killer. The fact that the killer was so prolific meant to Douglas that he could function unnoticed within the community. Someone who worked independently, most likely a business owner. The killer would be an avid outdoorsman, since the bodies were recovered in remote areas of wilderness. Since he preyed on prostitutes, Douglas concluded the killer had difficulty talking to women, had low self-esteem, and grew up feeling like an outcast. Based on killers with similar profiles, Douglas provided a specific characteristic to explain the cause of those feelings of inadequacy, a feature that bore an eerie resemblance to Robert Hansen.
The one that totally blew us all away, I think, is that when they said he's either going to be a stutterer or someone who has a lisp, a speech defect. How do you figure that? But that was one of the things that they suggested might show up.
The FBI profile pointed to Robert Hansen, But the depths of Douglas's insight were about to be known. Upon Van Clausen's return, troopers studied the files. The records showed that Hansen had spent 3 years in a reformatory for setting fire to his old high school's bus garage. Based on their work with previous killers, the FBI profilers said the killer would have a history of arson.
You have a boyfriend?
Yes, actually I do.
Yeah, because
The profile painted the killer as a social misfit. Hansen's court-ordered psychiatric reports from his days at the reformatory bore this out.
Yes, I'm really busy right now, you know.
I don't mean anything like, I mean...
His stutter was a social barrier that undermined his self-confidence. Whenever he tried to assert himself, he'd be slapped
I have a lot of
down.
work to do, or I'm gonna call security on you.
He never forgot the sting. The profile said the killer would learn to function as a normal member of society while his perversions festered within. His record showed that in his 30s, Hansen began working at a bakery. He would brag to co-workers about his kleptomania and the sense of power it gave him. He also bragged about his love of hunting. He took great pleasure in exerting power over his prey, stalking it, then wounding it, and he became good at the kill, winning prestigious awards. In 1967, he moved to Alaska to start a new life and for better hunting. 3 years after moving there, his record showed he was arrested for the attempted rape of a young receptionist at gunpoint. He pleaded no contest to assault with a deadly weapon. A little more than a month later, he was indicted for the attempted assault of an 18-year-old woman he'd followed home.
As soon as the man got to Alaska, he was involved in theft cases, he was involved in abductions, he had psychiatric evaluations showing him to be really unstable and having all kinds of weird sexual fantasies and the rest.
True to the profile, Hansen seemed a respectable citizen, so the courts were lenient. In one case, he claimed to have memory lapses and was given psychiatric treatment and 5 years in a work release program. He abducted one of his early victims outside a coffee shop, took her to a cabin in the wilderness, and raped her at gunpoint. She was 17 at the time.
He told me, of course, if I called the police, that he would hunt me down and kill me. He told me he was a fine, outstanding businessman. He had never mentioned at any point when during the rape time or before or after that he was married, but he said he's a fine, outstanding businessman and that I was just a kid and nobody would believe me.
And he was right. Everything the profiler said about the perpetrator of the serial killings fits suspect Robert Hansen, a truly dangerous man who was passing as a nondescript face in the crowd. While troopers zeroed in on Hansen, they spread out to search for more victims in the Knik River area, where 3 bodies had been found. They believed that the dancers who were still missing may have been buried close to the other grave sites. But troopers came up empty. The area was too large and remote to cover completely. Despite the compelling FBI profile and the past police records, troopers lacked anything tangible to link Hansen to the killings. His police records were too stale, the evidence too circumstantial to hold any weight in a court of law. Investigators hoped that Cindy Paulson could help. She was the only surviving victim to Hansen's current wave of violence. Perhaps she could remember something else from her ordeal. Paulson gave another statement. But this time, she was able to ID one of the guns Hansen had in his possession. Aside from Paulson, Hansen had not been implicated in a rape or abduction for more than 10 years. But in the hopes of strengthening their case and establishing a pattern of behavior, investigators searched for another of Hansen's victims from years earlier, whose experience matched Paulson's. Although this prior victim no longer lived in the area, troopers tracked her down and asked for her help.
I had gotten a call from Alaska asking if I would like to maybe help with a conviction for Mr. Hansen. They had explained to me that he had killed, to the best of their knowledge, 7 women. And they explained to me that the last woman had broken free.
She agreed to testify when the time came, but troopers still had a weak case. The troopers felt confident they were on the right track. They didn't have enough to prove that Hansen was a serial killer. According to Anchorage Police Officer Greg Baker, Hansen knew that authorities were onto something.
One morning I was driving by and I needed to get some donuts for the shift. Mr. Hansen was there, and he had a window that he stood in and decorated cakes and cupcakes and cookies. And I remember watching him. He kept looking up at me, and you could tell he was nervous. And he kept putting frosting on his thumb. And I liked that.
Although investigators had Hansen in their sights, they still lacked the evidence to connect him directly to the crimes. But because Hansen matched the profile so closely, Douglas flew to Alaska to review the case and to brief the troopers and prosecutor Frank Rothschild on how to proceed with the suspect. Douglas was confident that Hansen was their serial killer. The hunter was now the hunted.
So the mission was to provide a analysis for them. Does he have the capability to commit a crime like this? And the answer was yes. I believe this prostitute, and I believe he's capable of perpetrating these crimes.
Douglas's idea was to bring Hansen in for questioning while simultaneously searching his house. To obtain a warrant, investigators needed to list specific items they believed to be in the house. They knew to look for the gun that Cindy Paulson described, and the one that fired the bullets found in the graves of Sherry Morrow and Paula Goulding. That wasn't enough. They needed a home run, something that would prove Hansen's guilt in no uncertain terms. They asked Douglas if there was anything else to list in the warrant.
Yes, some of the research findings is we're dealing here with a serial killer. And serial killers, it starts off as fantasy. And one of the things to keep the fantasy going after the crime is because they're on the hunt nightly looking for victims, is they take some type of memento. We call them either souvenirs or trophies, something belonging to the victims.
Douglas helped prosecutors write the affidavit based on the likelihood of finding mementos mentioned in the profile.
Okay, anything else? I've got those 2.
Anything from a piece of the victim's jewelry to a driver's license.
We don't have any.
But a behavioral profile had never been used as the basis of a search warrant in the United States before. Rothschild knew he'd need to back it up with more conventional information.
Obviously, the district attorney's office wanted this search warrant to be bulletproof. They wanted it to be absolutely, positively, without flaw, because they knew this was a big, big case. The last thing they wanted was to have something wrong with the search warrant and have all the evidence thrown out.
The affidavit swelled to 48 pages. The judge granted 8 search warrants for Hansen's property. Now, they just needed Hansen. They had learned his pattern, knew his schedule. On October 23, 1983, they went to pick him up at his bakery. But Hansen wasn't there. He'd gotten off to a late start, unwittingly keeping the troopers waiting 20 tense minutes.
Robert Hansen, Alaskan police sergeant. Will you step away from your car?
When asked to come in for questioning, he didn't resist. The interrogation room was ready for him. The goal was to keep him off balance, hoping to elicit a confession and avoid a lengthy legal case. Douglas helped the troopers design the interrogation room for the biggest psychological impact. Crime scene photos and related materials were strewn everywhere for Hansen to contemplate before his interview. At the appointed moment, the troopers arrived,
Hello, Mr.
and the
Hansen.
mind game began.
Mr. Hansen?
The FBI coached Rothschild on how to play it.
Ask him questions in a way that would prompt more discussion. So that's game plan number one. Then obviously we've got all of these cases that have been investigated. And to get him to talk specifically about those, he's trying to search us out. What do we know? So I could see his game plan was to kind of find out what we knew and play off of that. And my game plan, of course, is to find out what he knew.
While Rothschild tried to get Hansen to open up and confess, troopers served the search warrants. Hansen's wife was home. The troopers were extra cautious, videotaping the entire procedure. What they were looking for could be anywhere, even in plain sight. Hansen knew the troopers had access to his police and psychological records. He didn't tell authorities anything they didn't already know. He spoke of his painful upbringing, his strict family, his anger. He admitted to picking up dancers and prostitutes in the early 70s, and how enraged he became when they tried to raise their prices. But he denied threatening any of them. He admitted nothing. While Hansen told his story and his house was being turned inside out, other troopers headed to his bakery and to the airport to search his plane. Both were clean. The house became the focal point of the investigation. A careful search of the upstairs bedroom finally yielded a curious and eerie discovery. An aerial map of the region, peppered with 37 X's. They seemed to be clustered mainly around the area where bodies had been found. But there were dozens more marks than bodies, at least so far. The searchers continued up to the attic. Under insulation, the troopers found weapons. Among the items found were a .223 Ruger Mini 14 rifle, like the one used to kill Sherry Morrow and Paula Goulding, and a wood-handled revolver resembling the one described by Cindy Paulson.
Yeah.
The search team let Van Clausen know the good news.
Sounds good. These women look familiar? Have you ever seen them?
The net was closing on Hansen, and he knew it. But he wasn't ready to talk just yet.
Take another look.
The interview dragged on for hours. It didn't seem like a confession was likely.
I haven't. I've never seen it.
While troopers collected the evidence, the case unwound even further. Hansen's friend and neighbors stopped by, curious about the activity. She was stunned by the news, then made a confession that demolished the last of Hansen's story. She told troopers that her husband provided Hansen with his alibi on the night of Cindy Paulson's abduction. He'd lied to protect his friend, not realizing how serious Hansen's charges were. The husband later called police and retracted his statement. Hansen's alibi evaporated. As the search continued, the troopers found the most incriminating evidence so far. Evidence that Douglas knew had to be there somewhere. They found Sherry Morrow's necklace and other personal property belonging to the dead or missing women. They had found Hansen's stash of trophies.
Yeah, this is Baker here.
Investigators called the station. Though they had Hansen where they wanted him, still he wouldn't confess. But they had enough to lock him up on the Cindy Paulson case. Bail was set at $500,000. Investigators now had time to build their case against Hansen as a serial killer. They called the prior victim to see if she was still on board.
And at that time, they thought he had killed 11 women. And was I still interested in being a witness? They really felt that they may need me because he hadn't confessed.
All right, what you got?
3 points on the map found in his bedroom matched the locations of bodies recovered by the troopers. Another X marked the location of a body recovered by Seward police years earlier. The remaining X's presumably marked the graves of more victims, dozens of them.
Looking at the map obviously was pretty chilling because we believed the map. The map was a body count as far as we were concerned. The man had kept track. He didn't have newspaper clippings. He had the map.
When the troopers believed they had enough to convict Hansen on at least 4 murders, they confronted him and his lawyer with the evidence. Hansen couldn't refute it. He had no place left to hide. Finally, it was time to confess. Time for Hansen to cut a deal. Hansen said he would confess to the murders that could be proven, as long as the trial was given no publicity and that his family be left alone. He demanded that he be imprisoned outside of Alaska when the trial was over. In exchange for only 4 convictions, he agreed to show the troopers where more bodies were buried. Investigators called the prior victim to tell her the good news.
The 3rd time they called back and said that he had confessed and they wouldn't need me. So I hung up the phone when we were done talking. I got my son off to school, got my husband out the door, and proceeded to fall apart. I started crying. I couldn't stop. I had no control over it. It controlled me. I could see each and every one of those women, how they died, probably hunted down like dogs, wounded and then hunted more.
In his confession, Hansen described how he would take his victims into the woods and hunt them as prey. Over the dozen years that he lived in Alaska, he'd raped more than 30 women and developed many strategies for capturing them. Once he found a likely target, a solitary woman like Sherry Morrow. He would befriend her and arrange to meet her at a fast food place. If they were dancers or aspiring models, he'd offer to pay to photograph them. He'd arrive early and stay in his car. That way he'd be certain the woman arrived alone and had no one waiting for her in the parking lot. No witnesses. Then he'd go in and meet his new victim. One half of the handcuff was already fastened to the seat. Hansen boasted that snapping the other half onto his victim's wrist while reaching for his gun became like a reflex. Then he would take them home or to a remote motel to rape and torture them. Afterwards, he'd blindfold them and drive or fly them to the outskirts of town until he arrived at a secluded spot, his hunting ground. His habit was to toy with his prey before he made the kill. Hansen confessed that in the summer of '83, he devised what he called his summer plan. He sent his family away so he could bring his victims home. When he was done with them, he'd dispose of them in the wilderness. On February 27, 1984, Robert Hansen was convicted of murdering 4 women and sentenced to 461 years plus life with no chance of parole. After his sentencing, Hansen accompanied troopers into the field to find more of his victims, represented by X's on his map. A total of 8 victims were found. Some places on the map went unexplored. Bears scavenged others, scattering the remains. Investigators will never know how many of the 37 X's represented one of Hansen's victims. According to John Douglas, the map might have depicted only a small part of his hunting grounds.
Killers like Hansen will come into contact with a lot of women, but fantasy is everything, and they may not like the way the person talks or the person dresses, the style, and so they'll make a decision. Well, this one will live. This one over here will die. I believe he was good for a lot more cases, and I still believe there was a chance that one of the reasons that caused him to go up to Alaska, he was running away from homicides back in the lower 48.
In the United States, an estimated 35 to 50 serial killers are active at any given time. Profiling has made them easier to spot and apprehend. Each time one is captured, investigators learn more about their twisted motivations, making it easier to catch the next one.